weather has always been a strategic desire to control by the generals, whether it was Napoleon marching towards Moscow, or Hitler in his Russian campaign, or our own Pacific Fleet trying to understand typhoons and use them for our strategic advantage. War and weather are very closely connected, and they've been connected ever since about 1812 or so, maybe earlier than that. Hannibal had to face the snows in the Alps, and so there's a long history of weather and warfare interactions. One of the ideals of the Air Force is to have this all-weather Air Force, or to have their pilots coming back safely and using the weather as a salient against the enemy and clearing out their own airports from, say, from ice fogs or from bad weather. And so if the idea here is that if we can fly and they can't, that's a great military advantage. There was also research studies on hurricanes that the scientists were truly curious about the behavior of hurricanes, but their military patrons were very interested in how to steer them or direct them in certain ways, almost as a guided weapon. One of the biggest concerns of early cloud seeding, weather control activities by the General Electric Corporation, came from their lawyers, who thought that the corporation was totally vulnerable to lawsuits, because if they started to make fair or foul weather, the people down below in Massachusetts or downwind of Schenectady could institute massive lawsuits that could put GE out of business. So the first response to weather control from their in-house lawyers was to shut it down, was to give the project to the military and ask them to do it, with the GE lawyers only being the consultants on the project. So they were allowed to suggest and design certain activities, but they weren't allowed to touch anything or throw anything out of the plane. Military moment, and it was actually from pretty recent history. And this was the U.S. military thinking that they might be able to control the monsoon over Vietnam during that conflict. And so only a handful of top-level military advisors and the president were informed that they were going to try to make it rain over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and try to have some military advantage by doing this kind of intervention.
When you start talking about manipulating the environment, we have treaties that go back to the mid-70s that forbid this, number one, as weapons of war.
So the perfection of weather modification took place, but it became apparent that using weather modification for wartime purposes was not acceptable to the United States government and other nations of the world. So therefore, the NMOD Treaty came into being and was signed by the United States government after passing Congress. The reason it was signed and implemented was because it would ban warfare, weather modification techniques and use during times of war.
Almost all of our treaties that we've signed, including the non-proliferation, counter-proliferation treaties, chemical treaties, the ones that were signed recently, last few years, back maybe a decade now, I guess time goes. But they had domestic exemptions, and so does the environmental treaty, where you can do whatever you want in your own territorial boundaries. When you start manipulating weather in one part of the planet, it doesn't look on the ground and say, oh yeah, wait, this is the boundary of a political boundary. It fails to recognize those. So you start to talk about geophysics and manipulating the planet itself. Then it's a question of those kinds of exemptions shouldn't even be allowed.
Meteorology and the military have a very long history, as I said, and it goes into the strategic advantage that multiplies your traditional force, that is your armament, into using nature to your advantage as well. In fact, the setting up of the storm tracks, the jet stream, the location of the storms. And so you end up with an intervention on the solar side of things would pretty directly begin to affect the weather patterns. And so climate control, or attempted climate control, and weather control rely on this very large spectrum of intervention. If you think of Western history, there's a lot of it concerning water rights and even water wars. And so there was shooting about access to water to water your livestock. And now people are thinking, or at least the people who are involved in weather control sometimes think about the river of moisture above our heads. And geez, if we could just tap that. But that too is a water right that would involve access to the people that that felt that maybe they had prior rights over it.